One of the things that the League prides itself on is educating people about things that are important for them and for their families. And certainly, funding of public education is one of those things that we all find very important, whether we are students ourselves, parents, grandparents, or just concerned members of the community. So having you here this evening to listen to this is just very important to us. We will be streaming this live this evening, which I'm very excited to be able to tell you about. And also we will have it on both the educational channel and the public access station. And we do have a YouTube account, and if you go to our website, it will direct you to that afterwards. So if you have friends who haven't seen this, have been unable to come this evening, they can still see what we have presented here later on. We are in this building because TCAPS is also sponsoring this program, and we would like to thank TCAPS for being so gracious and so accommodating. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening, Anara Kurt.
Thank you, Donna. We're going to kind of hold it down a little bit because John Austin is being interviewed by Channel 7 and 4 right now, so he couldn't say no because they were insistent they want it on tonight's news. Thank you, Donna, who, by the way, as our local league president, will be recipient of the Liberty Bell Award by our local bar association on Law Day, May 1st, and we think that's wonderful. And thank you, Catherine Dean, for your outstanding work as program chair and for organizing this important public forum. Thank you. Good evening and welcome to this public forum put on by the League of Women Voters of Grand Traverse Area and co-sponsored by Traverse Area Public Schools. The purpose of our forum is to give you an opportunity to understand and ask questions about current education funding proposals being considered by the legislature and to discuss the Michigan Public Education Finance Act, also known as the Oxford Plan. It takes a lot of people to put on a league forum. I would like to acknowledge the league team working today. Susan Cogswell, Pat Larman, Bev Newsom, and Jane Watts were your greeters today. Our timekeeper will be Ronnie Elf. Barb Berry, Linda Crandall, Jean Howard, Rachel Johnson, and Kathy Kelto will be our question screeners and runners. And thank you, Ingrid Brophy and Catherine Dean, for organizing our refreshments. We also appreciate the Traverse Area Public Schools for generously agreeing to co-sponsor this event and for providing this facility, the technology, and all the setup. Thank you, Steve Cousins, Keena Tibbetts, Larry Burden, Debbie Berg, and Gary Derrigan. I am Inara Kurt, and I will be the moderator this evening. And now a word from your local sponsor, which is the League of Women Voters. The League of Women Voters is a national, nonpartisan, political organization organized in 1920 and committed to encouraging the informed and active participation of citizens in their government. Membership in the League is open to all citizens of voting age, male or female. The League as an organization does not endorse or oppose candidates or parties, but it does make an effort to obtain factual information on issues, and we distribute this information as widely as possible. The format for this evening, and the panelists have been informed of this, each panel member may take up to 10 minutes for an opening statement to discuss their questions and concerns regarding proposed public school funding. Members of the audience will then be invited to submit questions on the provided cards, and you had them on your seats, and if you need more, just raise your hand and a runner will bring them to you. The questions will be collected and reviewed by the screeners who will look for relevancy, propriety, clarity, and legibility. We try to avoid duplication, and screeners will try to group the questions by topic. I will read the questions, and panelists will take turns being the first responder to audience questions. We ask that initial responses be limited to 2 minutes, with the other panel members having an opportunity to respond to the same question if they wish to do so. We hope to cover all the questions, but if there isn't time to do so, please ask it directly of the panelists after the forum, and we will also make sure that they get copies of the questions that were not covered. Each panelist will then have 5 minutes to make a closing statement at the end of the question and answer period. The forum is being videotaped by Larry Burden from TCAPS and will be available for viewing on the public access channel through Up North TV and YouTube. We will try to notify you of the broadcast dates on our local league website. And if you picked up one of the brochures, they represent you. Our league website is on the back. Our league prides itself on promoting civil discourse in discussing issues or when we debate candidates. Please be mindful of that, and please remember this is a respectful discussion of a serious issue. In the interest of time, please hold your applause until the end of the forum. We also appreciate feedback and we pay attention to it. Please fill out the evaluation forms, which will be distributed toward the end of the forum. And now I'd like to introduce to you the members of our panel, Dr. David Arson. And we do have a empty chair there because we might have another board member joining us, according to John Austin, who's the president of the State Board of Education. And the name is Dr. Richard Ziley. Okay, so if somebody comes up there, that's who it is. Stephen Cousins, Superintendent of Traverse Area Public Schools. And last but not least, Michael Murray, Superintendent of Sutton Bay Public Schools. We will now begin with opening statements. Each panelist has up to 10 minutes. Audience, if you have completed questions during this time, please hold them up, and one of the runners will pick them up. And Dr. Arson, will you please begin?
Sure. Here? Or here?
No, they will pick you up. There's microphones there, according to Larry Burton. They'll pick up your sound.
Well, maybe I'll, is it all right? I'll move, it might be a little more cohesive if I'm down here. Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the League for the invitation. I think since I'm leading off, I will offer a little bit of background information on the Oxford proposal before offering some comments on it. Last summer, Governor Snyder requested legislation to profoundly change funding for Michigan's K-12 schools with the sweeping replacement of the School Aid Act of 1979. The proposed funding system was drafted by the Lansing-based Oxford Foundation. Richard McClellan led the effort. Their charge was to facilitate a 21st century learning model in which funding is student-centered, not district-centered, and focused on things that work, so it's more cost-effective. They also sought to allow non-public school students and homeschool students maximum access to public education resources. Now, since Proposal A passed in 1974, school funding in Michigan has followed students as they move from one district to another, to a charter school, and more recently to an online school. So the governor's proposal had two key innovations. The first is that it unbundles education services. Rather than all state funding following students to a single school that they enroll in, students could split that state funding across multiple education providers. In a standard 6-hour day, they might go to 6 different districts or different providers. Since transportation could inhibit that flexibility, the proposal envisioned a robust expansion of online instruction. The proposed proposal calls its second key innovation performance-based funding. Students would take standardized tests at the start and end of each course, and schools would lose a portion of their state funding, expected to increase over time, for every student that did not make sufficient progress. The Oxford proposal was explicitly designed to operate in conjunction with 2012 House Bill 5923, which would allow new entities, these are new forms of schools, private businesses, municipalities, cultural institutions, to establish public schools in virtually any location with little oversight and without regard to their impact on existing schools. Significantly, this bill allowed certain of these new schools to use selective enrollment based on student academic ability, on student gender. Schools established by private companies could give preferential enrollment to the company employees. These two pieces, the House Bill 5923 and the Oxford funding proposal designed to work together, would represent a truly dramatic strategy to shift the provision of education services outside locally governed school districts. They would establish the closest approximation to a universal statewide voucher system ever implemented in the United States. The idea was that it would go forward in the fall, that the Oxford proposal would be in the governor's budget, and the current one that's being discussed now. But with so many high voltage policies commanding attention in the fall, the progress on these landmark legislation stalled and left it to the current legislature. I'll not talk about some more recent innovations. The skunk work group, maybe John, you can pick that up. So there have been some scurrying around just about what's going to happen with these ideas. I won't go into that right now. I want to take my time to offer some general comments about them. Is that okay?
Certainly.
And I just say, first off, the proposal was not ready for prime time. There were many, many details that were not worked out. They couldn't really, if they had delivered it to be acted on, it would have been embarrassing. The issues about the testing, not worked out. The accounting system necessary to do this, not worked out. Issues about special education, right? How could you have an IEP for individual students and then have parents make their choices about where to send the kid without regard to the education professionals? Lots of things like this were still left to be resolved. I don't want to talk about that right now. I want to give a little bit of context because I am a specialist in school finance. I want to give a little bit of context about there are some problems with the existing funding system. Just bring them out on the table, just remind folks, and say these problems are not addressed by the Oxford proposal. In fact, the proposal would make each of them worse. Okay? So the first thing I just want to mention is the overall amount of money. Is there enough money? The Oxford reformers did not ask what their proposal would cost or where the money would come from. They didn't even examine trends in funding. If they had, they would have discovered that since 2002, real per-pupil funding for Michigan K-12 schools, that is in the districts and charter schools, revenue from state and local sources has declined by 25%. Okay? A lot of that becomes a slowdown in the economy, reduced tax revenues, but 60% of that decline is due to reduced tax efforts. If we had only been taxing ourselves at the same share of income as we did in 2002, revenues per pupil revenues would be $1,600 higher today than it is. Massachusetts, the highest performing state in the country on most measures, spends 40% more per pupil than Michigan. We are the lowest spending state of the Great Lakes region, lower even now than Indiana. The Oxford proposal does nothing to arrest this disinvestment in education. Rather, it creates new drains on available revenues. Second question, how is the money distributed? The governor's proposal completely ignores equity and adequacy. The state's current funding formulas distributing revenues across districts and charter schools are not fair. They do not reflect the differential cost of expensive special needs students, regional cost of living differences, or variations in declining enrollments. Okay? It costs more to educate a poor child than a rich child to meet state standards. School choice policies exacerbate this problem. Okay? Our funding system gives choice schools a strong incentive to enroll low-cost students, elementary versus secondary students, regular education instead of special education students. In doing so, lowers their average cost in the choice schools while simultaneously increasing the average cost in the schools that the students formerly intended. The governor's policy would exacerbate this tension that we already have. Good schools provide many services, libraries, transportation, social workers, sports, and so on. By failing to recognize these services in the funding formulas, it would discourage schools from providing them, and over time, they would be converging the services to more strict-line online vendors. Third, the proposal creates inefficiency in a lot of forms. It would increase administrative costs to implement a complex system of student record keeping. It introduces new ways for enterprising service providers to game the system, so it required costly monitoring procedures to discourage misuse of public funds, and it would increase transportation costs for schools, move schools from one building to another. I would just say that education efficiency demands good instructional practice. The drafters of this proposal don't know much about teaching and learning. The proposal fails to recognize that effective schools establish cohesive cultures that inspire and coordinate the efforts of all their students and educators. And a plan that encourages students to move helter-skelter from school to school could undermine outcomes for choosers and non-choosers alike. I'll just mention quickly that in our existing experiences with choice, we see that in, for instance, charter schools, they are not driving the state revenue to the classroom. They have about the same amount of revenue, but they're spending about $1,000 less per pupil on instruction than traditional public school districts in Michigan on average. They're spending about $800 per pupil more on administration than districts. What would prevent these programs from reinforcing this top-heavy reallocation of school spending? I want to mention one other thing. I know I'm probably getting close to my time.
She'll let you know.
School facilities. Michigan school facilities are funded entirely by local property taxes, and variations in property wealth from one community to another create huge inequalities in the ability of local communities to pay for facilities. Property taxes would have to be 10 times higher. The rates would have to be 10 times higher in low property wealth districts at high to establish the same funding levels for facilities. This is something that most states address. They give equalizing aid for facilities. Michigan does not. The only thing that Michigan has done for a long time is lowering the borrowing cost by letting local districts draw on the state's borrowing rate through the state school bond loan fund. The local districts still pay for it, and the amount they pay is unequal because of their property wealth. Okay? Remarkably, at the very end of the last session in December, something happened. The governor signed something that you didn't read about in your newspaper. He signed legislation that would put an end even to that revolving school bond loan fund, essentially putting an end within a year of local districts' ability to borrow to build facilities and technology and so forth. This is inefficient.
That was your time. Thank you very much. And can we remember, please, let's hold our applause until the end so we can move through this fairly efficiently, speaking of efficiency. And next,
Great.
Mr.
I'm
John Austin.
President of the State Board of Education. Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. No, maybe we can slide the technology this way. On behalf of the State Board of Education, I very much appreciate the League and all of you and TCAP, the Traverse City Schools, for convening and participating in these forums. We've been eager to both participate in and facilitate and convene these kinds of public discussions, largely because, as you can tell from Dr. Arson's description, with such big changes and potential impact on our schools being discussed in Lansing, it is imperative that you all, citizens, parents, voters, educators, who care about the success of our schools, understand the nature of what's being proposed and then weigh in. Because education is one topic that everyone, Republican, Democrats, and your legislators of any stripe, they actually want to do right by public schools. So it's very important that you send the message as you appreciate what's being discussed, that says, here's things we support that are good reforms, good ways to support our schools. Here's things we oppose that are destructive to our education system and our public schools. And so that's a big part of why we're convening and participating in these forums, and appreciate the opportunity to do that. Just a minute on the State Board of Education. You elect us statewide. I'm privileged and honored that you elected me twice, whether you knew what you were doing or not, along with my colleagues on a statewide partisan basis. 8 of us, 8-year terms, so we're free from day-to-day political pressures to try to do the right thing on your behalf. Dr. Ziley, one of my colleagues who was elected in 2000, said he would be here, so I hope he may still appear. But we take very seriously our role. We're charged with the Constitution to provide leadership and supervision all over all education, and to recommend to the governor and legislature what it takes to educate kids and what it takes to finance that education of our children. And I encourage you to go to our website, michigan.gov/MDE, michigan.gov/MDE, and click on the State Board of Education. You can communicate with us. You can see our recommendations, which we make on an ongoing basis for what we think needed reforms are, what we recommend to the governor and legislature we should be doing in Lansing, our positions on legislative and other ideas of the moment, including these school finance ideas. So we encourage you, and part of what we're doing is sharing our perspective, but we're also being informed by your perspective at these forums. And let me just say, we as a board have been eager to continue to advance and encourage education reforms. We have done a lot of education reform, from expecting more of our students, high standards, which we want to keep in place, to expecting more of our teachers. We've made a lot of changes in the ongoing professional requirements for teachers, to changing the way we deliver instruction and encouraging whole new models, new effective variants of learning, whether it's blended learning, project-based learning, rigorous career technical programs, early colleges, middle colleges, remaking the high school to be effective. All of these are things we need to keep advancing on. And we need to change the business of education. We need to change the way we fund the non-instructional services or support them to find efficiencies. But all of that, and as the State Board have said, and our recommendations to the governor and legislature have been and are, and while we're frustrated, we do not control the purse strings, your elected legislators do. We can't appropriate money. But we've said, while we make these reforms, the point of making those reforms is so we can invest more money, and we need to invest more money in pre-K, early learning expansion, which we're seeing some movement on, and we want to keep encouraging. But we need to invest more in our schools, our K-12 schools, so we can support great teachers, keep class sizes decent, not have our teachers be demoralized and cut the things that they need, then give our schools strength, including important things like we're in a performance area right here. Arts, band, extracurriculars, the student newspaper, counselors that can guide our kids. All of those, because of what David articulated, the budget cuts and tax cuts, which have been nonsensical that we've been on for the last dozen years really, and we just did a big round of tax cuts in the last year or two. That's why we are not putting the money where we need to, which is in education, and better support for higher education, keeping tuition rates low at our universities. They've been rising because we've been cutting them. We've been dismantling our support for education at every level, which is a totally wrong path to support economic prosperity, to support better opportunity for our children and our state. So we've been very strong in recommending more investment in education while we make reforms, and we need both hands clapping. We need to make change in the way we run education to make it be more effective, but we need to provide better support. So we have been demoralizing the very people, the educators, who we need to better help and support and empower and pay and reward and find satisfying careers in teaching, the most important thing that moves the needle for student achievement. And that's why it has been so disturbing to deal with proposals that David described that began to quietly emerge in lame duck. They were going to get these things done in lame duck. They were going to look to pass. Senator Pavlov, the Republican chair of the Senate Education Committee, and Richard McClellan, the architect of these proposals, basically said, how did you spot the big conspiracy to get this unlimited, unregulated, new school, specialty school, for-profit school, online school creation legislation, which was teed up to go? that was ready to be passed. How did you spot that? And I said, well, we spotted it because it was going to destroy public education. The things wrong with that legislation, David talked about some of them. They wanted to let anybody and everybody open a new school if someone would authorize it, a public body. And we have public bodies like Bay Mills Community College and some of our universities that will authorize anything. So the only thing that makes it not a voucher program is that we still have public institutions that will authorize for-profit schools, outside companies selling education wares. They wanted no quality control, meaning they wanted vendors of education services and charter operators for-profit who we know have a bad record educating kids, who run bad schools today. They wanted no limits on their ability to open up new schools. They weren't willing to make them teach to the same standards that we want to assess all schools. As David said, they weren't willing to deal with how do you work special education students, how do you serve everybody in these new providing these new education provisions. So, we do not need more bad schools and new vendors selling online learning that is of either dubious or potentially poor quality. We want to create new choices if they're going to enhance learning. But the fact there were no provisions for how we would enhance new options that were of quality that provided better learning, and no consideration of the drain on your schools if someone's selling a bright, shiny, sign up 1-800 free public education, you'll get a nice free online school. We've seen what happens in the higher education world when for-profit companies start offering to take your Pell Grant and your GI Bill and sell you a program. And now we're cleaning up the mess as a country from those people taking money, not educating people, and we can't let the same thing happen in K-12. Now, the fact that we called it out, you called it out and said, this legislation and the school finance ideas that were going to come to allow people to shop in this unregulated marketplace, it would blow up our public school system, dismantle existing schools, and create an unregulated marketplace of for-profit schools as a replacement to the system we have. I mean, that's part of the ideological goal behind some of McClellan and his allies. They want to dismantle the public education system as we have it, the school boards, superintendents, and teachers unions, and create a parallel structure of for-profit, unlimited charters, and other schools. I mean, that's unfortunate, but there's a political motivation along with a theology about a marketplace for education being more effective in educating kids. A marketplace doesn't regulate itself, so the fact that they want no regulation on this marketplace, no quality control, means they're not serious about creating a marketplace that's going to deliver better outcomes. So when we called this out collectively, and it didn't happen in lame duck. A lot of things happened in lame duck last fall. This did not, because people, Republican and Democratic legislators, heard enough that your vote could be destructive to public schools, that no one wants to make that vote. And that's why in education, everyone wants to be on the right side of what you tell them to be, that's going to be supportive of public schools. Now, the fact that they took this discussion underground into what some of you may have seen was a secret work group, and McClellan can't help himself. He writes these very arrogant memos where he basically said, we have to do this now in secret because the counter-revolutionaries, that's what won the first round. That's us, the counter-revolutionaries, who said this stuff could do damage to public education, so let's have this secret skunk group meeting, which the governor's folks created. I mean, I'm always willing to give the governor benefit of the doubt, but this was his bidding to have this group. And the objectionable parts of this secret group were they purposely said, and they wrote down, no educators involved because they can't be trusted to support change and innovation. Only for-profit companies and IT people can work to design a system, and we want to end up really with a system that finds a way to deliver education with fewer teachers and more online services, and is cheaper, but also some of those companies delivering it would be making some money. So that obviously it doesn't stand the light of day, and certainly the term skunkworks stinks. So unfortunately, we had to, again, what are you doing here? This is not the way we work together to support innovation in education. We work together with the educators and the teachers and figure out how to flip it around. How do we use technology and online learning to improve and help teachers deliver better education? and to help teachers use that technology to do better by kids and their learning. Not how do we use technology to deliver mediocre, poor, we don't know education with fewer teachers. Teachers are the most powerful ingredient in kids'
Mr. Austin,
lives. So,
we're over time, so.
thank you.
Thank you.
We do need to keep making big change and innovation, but we need to do it the way that's going to work and be effective for all kids, and that's what we're here to discuss.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cousins.
First of all, I want to thank the League of Women Voters and two colleagues to the left for being here. I feel really safe now making more editorial comments than getting into the numbers. You did a great job. And John teed it up so that I don't have to worry about the legislators now being mad at me. They'll be mad at him. Notice that we're in a teacher's classroom. I mean, we're not in an auditorium. We're in a room where every day a teacher applies their professional craft to teach kids. And in this state, since 2003 at least, we have made it more difficult for her to do her job successfully. And it's time that we turned that around. There were definitely problems in this state in regard to funding that we had to take care of. We had an old model in this state that was built on the assumption that 3 of the largest corporations in the world would have their homes here and would provide very high-end, low-skilled jobs. My father worked at one of those for 39 years in Flint, Michigan at AC Sparkplug. It was a wonderful, wonderful time in Michigan, but when that industry began to die, the way that we funded government had to change. There's no question about that. And there's no question that schools had to change because we were teaching to the assumption that that would occur. 50 kids in my senior class at Flint Kearsley High School in 1977 who could have graduated left school in January because they already knew what they were going to do. They were going to go work at Buick, or they were going to work at Chevy Metal Fab, or they were going to work at the foundry, or they were going to work at AC Sparkplug with my dad, and they didn't see any reason to finish their education. They were going to get on with what they were going to get on with in their life. That's all changed. Kids today have to be a lot smarter than I had to be. They have to work a lot harder than I had to work, and they're expected to do a lot more than I was expected to do. Teachers then have a much harder job than my teachers had. They have to be better at what they do because they have to get more significant results. And our funding model in the state of Michigan has made it more difficult for them to do that, and we need to change that. And one of the biggest issues with that is equity. And before I get into that, I want to say this about, I'm going to make some specific comments about the Oxford report, or the Reform for Funding Schools model. But there's a philosophy floating around at the state level that if you innovate, that's a good thing. So innovation for innovation's sake, almost. And I do believe that we have to innovate, but I think we have to innovate in a way that's smart. I think you have to innovate for improvement. I don't think you just create something new to create something new. The proliferation of charter schools in the state without any thought to the quality or what difference they might bring to the lives of kids is an example of that. I'm certainly not against charter schools. We chartered one in Reese Puffer, that's where I came from, TCAPS. And we did it because we wanted to incubate a program that we didn't think we could replicate. But the idea is that if that works, we're going to scale it out and we're going to use it with as many kids as we possibly can. I think that's a good idea, but we wouldn't have proliferated all the choice, or all the schools in the state under choice had we taken that model. So innovation for itself doesn't necessarily get you the outcomes that you want. I want to note a couple things that I like about the thoughts that were going on in the original Oxford report from a general perspective. One is that freeing up the assets that we have in the state so that all kids can access them, that's a noble idea, that's a good idea. That would be a good thing if we could pull that off. And then allowing funding flexibility so that we could drive that kind of customization for kids, that's also another really noble and good idea in education. But again, innovation in of itself isn't necessarily improvement. If we were serious about doing that, we would pilot these ideas someplace This is what a tough nerd would do. You would pilot these ideas, you would study them, we would zero defect them, we'd standardize the things that worked, and then we would scale them out once we knew that they would work. And then we wouldn't assume that they would work for every kid. We would scale them out in places where we know where they would work, and then we'd keep working on the areas where we knew by doing that it wasn't going to change the life of a kid. That's what a smart, tough nerd would do. Here's my criticisms of the program. They openly have said that they're not going to address students with special needs. So how do you create a new system that leaves the most vulnerable within our education system unattended? To me, that's just unconscionable, and it demonstrates a lack of understanding of what teachers and principals do every day, what social workers and psychologists, what occupational therapists, what teacher aides, what everybody who works in the school does every day with the kids who are here and the families that come through the doors. They openly said that they don't have a solution to how we're going to track kids in their credentialing. Really? So how's that going to work? You can take 2 classes over here, and you can take a class over here, but we have no statewide system that we can put all that information in. So what we're going to do is create more inefficiencies within the system, because now you have to have more people to track that. And guess what? I'm pretty sure we're going to get blamed that we siphoned money off the classroom to pay for that once we do it, because we got another requirement, a mandate that required us to put another thing in place that costs money that somebody's not paying for. And so not thinking about what we do with our students with special needs or title needs, not thinking about what we're going to do to track this in the system. You can't just say you're going to create something and push those things off to the side. If you're going to have accountability, you have to have a way to track that. You have to put that someplace. And I want to make, I haven't heard this one before, and I want to make this comment. The single most important thing that we do to change learning of students in a school is the level of a teacher's craft. The better the teacher, the more a kid learns. I mean, that's like no-brainer research. And this potentially has the impact. Let's say this system was put in place, and you could track it, and they figured out a way to deal with the special needs kids. You know, if we could do that, I think there's some noble ideas in here. But here's another problem. Ideally placed, what it would do is create a situation where you may need to switch your staffing of your teachers in mid-year. Or you may need to, based on who enrolls at what given time, we may have to shuffle people over here. It potentially creates a situation where you don't have stability in the lives of the people who are actually doing the work. I mean, we could end up with a situation like community colleges where, rightly so, they have to rely on a lot of part-time faculty. So how do you build a profession of people who are supposed to be very effective at their jobs, and who I think have the most important jobs that people do in the community because they're messing around in the lives of kids? How do you build a profession that's going to continuously get better to meet the continuously demanding pieces of the job when we're breaking it apart and putting it into pieces? And I don't think that anybody thought about that. I haven't heard it talked about, but it scares the heck out of me in regard to who we can hire to put in front of kids and are going to teach them every day. I think that finally that this proposal doesn't even touch on equity. It's to the point of being a joke in the state. For those of you that don't understand how the system works, we won't even get into the school districts that have $5,000 more per student than the students from TCAPS. Let's just talk about the 2 basic funding systems. We call it the minimum foundation grant and the basic foundation grant. The school districts who get the basic foundation grant get just over $8,000 per student a year. The school districts like TCAPS who get the minimum get $6,966. You can tell that I know exactly what ours is, and I don't quite know what theirs is. But if we got the same level of funding as those schools, and these aren't even the ones that get $5,000 more, we would have $11 million more to improve the lives of our kids and to help our teachers and principals do what they're supposed to do every day. We cut $11.4 million just since 2008 in our district. And if we were just funded at the basic level, we have $11 million in one given year. And if that doesn't say it all in regard to that inequity, I don't know what else would. And I have 15 seconds left.
Well done.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cousins. Mr. Murray.
It's becoming clear to me why I'm on this panel tonight. I have a slightly different take on things. I represent a school district that is also 6966 as far as base funding, but is already doing many of these things. Can't hear you. Is this better? I can hear a little feedback now.
He'll take care of it.
Okay. I represent a district that is already doing a lot of these things. Our core belief is that it's our job to fit the school to the child, not fit the child to the school. And that sounds very simple, but it really has a lot of profound implications. And part of this 10-minute introduction is it's always dangerous to take a complex subject and try to simplify it down. But I'll try. A few years back, I was invited to become part of a think tank that met together with the idea that if regulations and funding were not an issue, what would a 21st century school look like? What are the important things that we needed to consider? The first conclusion we came to was that whether a child learned was much more important than when or where or how they learned. Now, the governor's translated that into anytime, any place, any way, any pace. But we looked at the situation and said, there's really a triangle. The triangle is that you have the content or the curriculum, you have student learning, and you have time. And that what we've been doing in schools since 1890 is we've been holding time as one of the constants, gradually changing the curriculum, and where we got the variation was in the student learning. And as a teacher, I always struggle with the issue of how do you handle all of these different students who learn in different ways and at different paces and in different styles, and went through all sorts of permutations with school districts. You know, I was in a district where we had a special education track, we had basic skills track, general education honors, AP track. You know, we started differentiating students out and separating them, trying to deal with this whole issue. And then, of course, you always had the alternative education track for the students who didn't fit into the school at all, and you put them off somewhere else, and usually what happened there was you lowered the standards of what you expected from them. So one of the assumptions that we went in with is what happens if we make mastery of learning the constant? What has to change? And what we found was those other pieces changed. And so students would have to be able to learn at individual rates and in ways that worked for them. We then began to question the whole idea of how we educate students. We batch them starting at kindergarten by age, and we work them through by age. Now, anybody who knows anything about kids knows that just because a child is 9 years old doesn't mean that all 9-year-olds are at the same place. There's a great variation in learning. So we looked at that. We looked at the whole idea of judging learning by equating it to time. You know, you see people trying to improve schools by saying, well, if we lengthen the school year, we lengthen the school day, we lengthen their exposure to classes, and then we try to measure that by standardized tests, which are one slice in time. So we questioned all of those assumptions and said, let's take all that out of the picture, and what does it look like then? Then you have individual students that the school tries to make a match to and figure out what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, what do they need, and then we need to have a good constant goal, and that's one of our problems we face in education is every time we zero in on a goal, they move it, and they change what we're expected to do. But last night I listened to Young Zhao make a speech, and he said, he simplified it. He said, the goal of college education these days is real simple. It should be that when you're 26, you're not living in your parents' basement anymore. And he had a good point, and it's been alluded to, is that the world has changed. And so there are a lot of trends that are going on. You know, when I grew up, I watched TV, there were 3 channels. You chose one of the 3. You know, how many choices do you have now? You took things because they were standardized. Now people expect customization. They expect things to be tailored to them. You know, when you go onto Amazon, you order books, it doesn't take long before they start throwing choices at you based upon what they know your interests are. There was a time when people did things because they were the common good. It was good for society. Now I think people's favorite radio station is WIIFM. What's in it for me? People have become very self-centered and expect things to be judged based on what is in it for the individual. So societal trends have changed. There was a time when information was very much controlled. You know, going back to early days when books were scarce, people memorized things because that's the way you carried information around with you. And then, again, going back to my high school days, when a paper was assigned to us, we all rushed down to the library because you knew that the first couple kids who got to the library got the books that were there on the topic you wanted because there were only so many books, and you had to have 3 sources. Now, you can come up with millions of sources. So there's no more control over information. Information is free. There's a lot of open choice. So those are some basic changes. And then, as Steve alluded to, a key one is that the skill level we expect from our students is a huge change. Basic skills jobs are either going to be automated or shipped overseas. And so the expectation for what we have to do for all of our students is tremendously going forward and going up. Now, one of the books that we looked at in this think tank was a book called Disrupting Class. Clayton Christensen and Michael Horn were 2 of the main authors for this. And what they did was they did case studies of how innovation works its way into a system. And they used example of DEC, who had the market on computers when computers were filling up the room half the size of a classroom and cost $500,000. And little corporations like Apple came along with these personal computers, which were little toys and gadgets, and they said, why would we want to get into anything like that? I mean, there's no money in it. They sell for $1,000. We're selling ours for $500,000, and they can't do much. But Apple quietly started building a following, and as they built a following, they got a market, and then they gradually started improving their product and improved the capabilities. DEC, by making the decision not to get into that, where are they today and where's Apple today? Toyota, when they first came onto the market against the big 3, was a tinny little import that played on the fact that American cars after 50, 60,000 miles were shot, so there wasn't a good used car market. So if you couldn't afford a good car, you would buy one of these cheap Japanese ones. But then they gradually started increasing and improving their product. I think that what we're looking at now is a similar situation in education. That given societal trends and given the needs, that we have an opportunity now to start taking a look at changes that are the wave of the future, that right now may not be in their final good form, but are worth looking at. So when we look at these proposals, what I would say is, don't just throw everything out because of the motives of some of the people for funding them. You know, I know that with the situation of public funding, one of the things that businesses do if you want to get rid of a department is you underfund it to the point where it's no longer effective, and then it goes away. And you know, we're seeing that happening to us. But there are some good ideas, as Steve alluded to, in these proposals. Online learning isn't the answer for everybody, but it's a tool that works. And what I have with Sutton's Bay Public Schools is we have 165 students in Jackson County. Now, 140 of those we get no money for because they were in another school district on October 3rd when the funding went out. So we have the students, we have the responsibility for educating them. We give them the classes, the teachers, the mentors, the support. They're on our records for our test scores. They affect our graduation rates, but somebody else gets the money for them. So the money doesn't really follow the student right now. And why do we do it when we get no money for them? Because if you have a student who's dropped out of school, 43% of these kids are homeless. 60% were in special education when in their schools. 83% are eligible for free and reduced lunch. You don't tell these kids, well, come back to us next year when there's going to be funding. We'd never see them again. You know, we have a responsibility for them. But a lot of these kids, they come into us, and what they say is, you know, online learning works for us. The key times that they work with for us are from 10 p.m. to 2 or 3 in the morning. Many of them work during the day to support themselves. Some of them have their own little children that they're taking care of during the day, and they want to get their education at night. But a lot of them are non-traditional learners, and they say, the relationship with the teacher is so much better in this online learning because in a classroom, if I'm ADHD and I find out my attention has wandered, I'm not going to raise my hand and say, teacher, I don't know what you're talking about, because then the teacher will think I'm dumb, the rest of my students in the classroom will think I'm dumb, so I don't do that. And then I don't understand the homework, so I don't turn it in, so the teacher thinks I'm lazy, and then I fail the test, and then I drop out of the course. They say, but on this online learning, I can go back and I can replay things over and over again. And I can ask a question, and I don't have to worry about who else hears it because it goes directly to the teacher. And our teachers are saying, you know, we know our online students better than we know the students in the brick and mortar classroom. So still, the teacher is key, and it takes special skills to do online learning. But let's not punish those who are trying to innovate. As an innovator, I find that left and right, every day, I find new ways that we get punished for trying to do the right thing. I think if we don't encourage and support our innovators, then we could end up like DEC Corporation, missing the changes in society.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. It is now time for our question and answer period, but I would like to introduce to you Dr. Richard Ziley. Did I say that correct? He's one of our state board members.
We previewed your appearance, but personal privilege, could Richard have a minute to just
Sure.
share a few thoughts?
If there's anything you'd like to say for a minute or two, and then we have our questions, so then you can just pop in when you need to with Mr. Austin.
Let me throw out a few thoughts then. I really resonated with Mr. Murray's comments there. I think that he is quite the triangle of student achievement, curriculum, and time. Where we hold the time constant, you're going to have variation in student achievement, and I think that's a pretty good insight. It raises the issue of equity that Mr. Cousins was speaking of. Equity really is talking about fairness. But when you think about it, what is fair, what is unfair? Fairness turns on our expectations. If you tell me these are the rules and then you change the rules, that's unfair. The rule itself, you discover, is often arbitrary. For example, driving on the right side of the road. That's just arbitrary. You could easily do it the other way. What is imperative is that everyone do it the same way. So we don't run into each other, and a lot of the rules that we make regarding education are of that nature. I find that a lot of us mistake in education, mistake a part for the whole. And cyber schools may be a case in point. Computers do a great job with certain kinds of learning, but not all learning is of the same kind. Half of education is the accountability and the guidance that a teacher provides to students. So where does that accountability and guidance, that person standing over your shoulder and making sure that you're doing your homework, is that being supplied by the computer? Is it being supplied by the parent? If half the job is being done by the parent, then it seems to me the parent should get half of the tuition grant and not the computer company get it all. Innovation, we have to recognize, is very threatening to those who are heavily invested in the system as it is. So if people criticize innovation, you need to scrutinize their motives, who they are accountable to. Are their interests to protect established interests of adults, or are they sincerely looking for the best interests of children? Now, having said that, I think, too, that we have sometimes lost sight of the real purpose of education. I was extremely frustrated at the Governor's Summit this last Monday because the theme is education as job preparation, and that is not what education is about. Education elevates the human individual, because when you read, you access other people's experience and grow in understanding. Your life is much more meaningful when you can read and access other people's experience. By the same token, when you can cipher, do arithmetic, you can control your own spending. You are no longer at the behest of the credit company. So education is empowering to individuals no matter what you do. And the fact that I can now read the manual that tells me how to operate the machine, that's a side benefit. What employers really need are not people who studied last year's skills. I took when I was in college, computing was hot, so I took a class in Fortran, okay? Okay, so by the time I hit the job market, it was already being out, What we need to do in schools is teach children how to learn, because no matter what job you get, you got to learn the specifics of that job. You got to learn to get along with other people, follow directions, et cetera, et cetera. And I am deeply disturbed that issues at the heart of educational failure are not being discussed. And let me give you an example. Charles Murray's latest book, the name of which I've forgotten, identifies 4 social values that correlate with prosperity: the work ethic, truthfulness, honesty in handling money, fidelity in marriage. In 2 years on the State Board of Education, we have not talked about the kinds of values that we're teaching, and there is very little, if any, acknowledgement that some unclearness on some of these values may lie behind this failure of students to be able to persist in school and furthermore in the job life thereafter.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay.
Can we thank you?
All right.
We need to move on to our question and answer period, and we're going to start with Dr. Arson, and then each of you, for each different question, we'll start with another person. If you wish to respond, I'll ask if anyone wants to. We're not going to go down the road for each question. This one was addressed to you, Dr. Arson, so I thought I would use it since you're the first one. Do you accept the conclusion of the research from Stanford, which concludes that charter schools in Detroit succeed at a higher rate than public schools? If so, why?
Yeah. The study that's being referred to is good research. I think I'm happy to see it. They did find that charter schools are doing well in Detroit. You might know that this finding comes against other studies. There are studies nationally. This is not generally the case. The previous studies in Michigan have not found this. I think it's a high-quality study. What I would say about it is that its relevance to what we're talking about here is limited. One of the things that you wonder about in a place like Detroit, the penetration of choice is so dramatic, and you have a place where half the kids are not going, who live in the place, do not go to the Detroit public schools, where half the children are not in the same school building from one year to the next. There's such a high degree of turbulence that a study like this doesn't tell us how the density of charter activity might have had an adverse impact on the performance of the district schools. Okay? So that's one. And so far, the question is, as you have more choice competition, does it improve the performance of district schools? The answer to that is no. And in fact, as an economist, you expect competition to make schools better. And there are good things about choice. If I had more time, I'd say there are good things about choice. But I'd also just close on this idea that one of the things that we haven't found is that the competitive effect of having other providers close by causes schools to increase their efficiency. In Michigan, it's a negative effect. The last thing is, that effect for the charter schools in Detroit is very different. That's not evidence for the Oxford proposal, right? Those charter schools, are the ones that work, are quite different from the kinds of things that we would be pausing about in these various open-ended proposals.
Okay, thank you. Is there, Mr. Austin?
I want to add to that, charters overall, and we have a very liberal freebooting creation of charters here. We have more charters, and we have a lot of them. On balance, are about the same as our traditional public schools across Michigan, meaning there's many excellent ones, there are many mediocre ones, and there are many poor ones. I want to go back to what Stephen said. Why do we have charters? I'm pro-charter if they're done to create an effective, innovative, new addition to our educational landscape. The problem, and most people don't want new choices for new choices' sake. They want a new choice, particularly when their public school is failing them. And that's what's happened in Detroit and other places where the public schools have not been succeeding. So you see a lot of new charters be created. And it's no surprise that we see a proliferation of choice and charters where the schools are failing. But we're also seeing across the board in Michigan, given our freebooting charter creation regime with no quality control, and Ed Trust just put out a report that I would call your attention to. Basically, we're seeing the expansion of the low-quality, non-performing charters at scale, not the expansion of the quality, good additions to our education landscape charters. So we're seeing a proliferation of charters and choice, but on balance, we're seeing more of the mediocre and poor education options coming into being, which do market and attract parents and sell them something that isn't a good education. And that both sucks resources from the public schools and does a disservice to the students who are enrolled. So there's excellent charters. I'm all for them. I would rather have us create them where we need them, where our schools are not performing well, to replace them or create new options, or to create a new innovative piece, as it sounds like in Traverse City. You know, create your own charter to provide a new, interesting, or effective alternative that you want to add to your landscape. That's how we should be doing charters, not anything goes charters.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Cousins, you had your,
Yeah.
did you want to respond?
I do. My wife's family's from Detroit, and I think we need to put something on the table in regard to when some of these comparisons are made in regard to charter schools and the traditional local school. And Detroit has had an exodus from Detroit proper that's gone on for over 40 years. And effectively what's happened in Detroit is that eventually anybody who could leave and go to another place, go to another school, has gone. So the population that's left behind, general statement, not totally always true, is the most difficult population to educate. Sometimes because moms and dads don't value education, so they stay where they are. They don't make another choice. Sometimes because they don't have the means to go someplace else. So we've created this very concentrated, difficult to teach, difficult to educate population, and then we've blamed the educators because they haven't been successful with that population, in spite of the fact we haven't given them the tools. It's akin to this. So just imagine if we were on the playground, we were kids, and we did that old thing where we choose teams. And we were going to have 6 teams, but we picked 5 captains, and we let all 5 captains pick who they wanted on their team, and then the last team was made up of everybody who didn't get picked for a team. They'd get clobbered. I almost said something I shouldn't have. You know, that's a bit of what's going on in Detroit, and my fear is that if we don't do this in a smart way, if we don't innovate in a smart way, and we don't study things, and we don't do pilots and figure out what works, we're going to replicate that all over the place. We're going to replicate that all over the place. And it's happened in Flint, it's happened in Detroit and Saginaw, it's happening all over. It'll happen in other places eventually if we let it go on too long.
Thank you. Anyone else? Dr. Zeile?
In discussing school choice in Detroit, you have to recognize more residents of Detroit enroll in suburban traditional public schools than in charter schools. The beneficiary of school choice in Detroit has been traditional public schools. This has enabled Royal Oak, for example, to continue an excellent program in strings, though Royal Oak itself has lost a great deal of population. So choice is not a threat to public schools that have quality programs. It's a boost. Secondly, I want to dissent from Mr. Austin's assertion that we have freebooting, uncontrolled charter schools in Michigan. On the contrary, charter schools have to comply with every regulation that pertains to other public schools. They have a charter contract with their authorizing agency, so they have more supervision and accountability than do traditional public schools. And the proof of the pudding is this, that when a charter school fails its students, it gets closed. When a traditional public school, such as my alma mater in Highland Park or others fail, they get more money. Last year, the highest per pupil funding from the state was Highland Park Public Schools. Another demonstration that funding levels don't correlate with educational quality. Thank you.
Thank you. Are we all set with that question? Okay. We now go to Mr. Austin. And this is sort of addressed to you too, so I chose that. When we send letters or emails to our lawmakers or governor, these letters voicing our concerns stay in their possession. Is there a tool for the public to express our concern online through the State Board of Ed or elsewhere on the michigan.gov website so that our concerns remain publicly visible for lawmakers and media and citizens to view? If not, will John Austin spearhead the creating and publicizing of this online public forum?
Yes, we welcome your input and then eagerly share them, but we should, and I'm frustrated, and sometimes frustrated in part with not Richard on this topic, but some of my other state board colleagues and superintendent to enable that kind of communication capacity, because we've talked about doing it to create a more public presence on the state board and the department's website for a forum with our constituents, which are you. And it's something I'd like to do and propose that we do, and we have not gotten agreement as a board, and I think we will now, and with that exhortation, and we haven't gotten help from our State Department to make it so. So I think we should be doing that because it's really important, and I'm disappointed as you are we haven't done as much of it today. And part of what we're doing here and by encouraging this communication is to do more of that.
What has been the objection with some of your board members to having I think if I read this question correctly, people just want something that you can access and see what people are concerned about?
Yeah. Some board members, I view our job as working for you and providing a forum where your views and our views as elected officials, as your representatives, can be publicly communicated. Not every board member believes that it is appropriate for elected officials like Richard and I are to be actively publicly communicating with you and or receiving and publishing your communications. Boards are interesting things. You know, we do try to work together and make agreements as a bipartisan board where we can and have majority votes to determine our policies. And this is one where I'm still trying to get a majority vote to enforce a more active, robust communication apparatus for us to serve you better.
Okay, thank you. Did anyone else wish to comment on that, on the panel? Our next one, we'll begin with you, Mr. Cousins. Have any of you had direct conversations with the governor or legislators who are promoting this legislation? If so, what response to your concerns?
I have spoken to our local legislators about it. Senator Walker heads up the Appropriations Committee for Education, so he's not an insignificant player when it comes to the funding pieces. Our local legislators didn't seem to be very well schooled on the Oxford report. It seemed that we spend a lot of time explaining to them what's in it, and they don't seem to be aware of it. Last year, it was either last year or the year before, Paul Soma and I had the opportunity to visit with Lieutenant Governor Kelly. And we were there to talk to him about at the request of someone else, to share the innovative programs that that TCAPS has created over the years and that we've been putting in place. And at that time, although the Oxford report wasn't out there and we weren't aware of it, we had the opportunity to talk to Lieutenant Governor Calley about what reforms we thought education, what the reforms in education should look like. And you know, maybe I'll talk about those a little bit in my closing statement, but the crux of that was to say, there are innovations that others have done that have proven track records, that research shows work. Why aren't we starting with those? Let's not reinvent things where other people have been successful. Let's move there first, and then as we create these other things, because we are creative people. People are creative people. We're creative beings. As we create these other solutions to problems, let's pilot them, let's study them, and then let's scale them out after we figured that out.
Okay, anyone else have had Mr. Murray?
The governor is hard to access. He has many layers around him. I have had conversations with Mr. McClellan, Mr. Riddell, Senator Pavlo, Senator Walker, numerous legislators, and I think it's important to have those conversations because increasingly what I'm seeing is that there is a gap between the legislature and the Department of Education, the Board of Education, and the superintendents and the school districts. I would say that our legislators feel like it's their mission to reform the schools. Their viewpoint is that the schools haven't done a very good job, and so the way to reform the schools is to bypass the educational community and to do it on their own. And that's why I think it's extremely important to maintain these contacts, and I work at it because I don't want to see that connection get totally broken. But, you know, there are deep-seated beliefs that with many of these legislators that they're out there to do what hasn't been done. They don't seem to understand the interconnection between schools and their communities and all of the various factors that affect student achievement. They seem to be focused in on the school organization, and that's only one part. And when you're trying to do systemic change, you can't work on one piece. You have to work on the whole system. That's the challenge, getting them to see that part.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. Anyone else want to? Mr. Austin?
Tuesday, I talked with the governor and talked with Bill Rustum at even more length, who's his strategy advisor and policy person, who I am very close to. And part of the message to the governor, you got to cut loose Richard McClellan and folks who are agents on your behalf who operate in a way that is both obnoxious and counterproductive by secret meetings and no educators. That is totally counterproductive to what we do need to do, and what I encourage, we need to, in public view, find ways to work together to describe the nature of the innovations that are going to improve learning. And I want to, to go back to what Michael Murray said. It makes it hard to disconnect some of the people behind some of this work, like Richard McClellan, with their agendas from the work, and that's why they should be cut loose. But I totally agree. Absolutely, and the board does, and we all do, that all we need to focus on is, are the kids learning effectively? Everything else, time, how they learn, where they learn, when they learn, under what circumstances, and what delivery mechanism, is what we need to figure out. And I think it leads us to, though, providing better help and better support and better education and training for the teachers to figure out how to personalize instruction and help those individuals learn in their individual way. It will lead us more there if we do it right. But absolutely, we should be working together to innovate, redesign learning. And that is what, the any pace, any place, any time stuff should be about, is how do we reorganize learning to be more effective and work on that together. But that is not helped when you have an agenda by some that we support figuring out how to help individualize instruction and accelerate learning for individuals and to do all the things that we need to do for individual success. We don't support what anytime, any place, any pace means in Florida, which is unlimited online education. Everybody learning online, which we don't know how that works, and it probably doesn't work for everybody either.
Thank you, Mr. Austin. Your 2 minutes are up. Was there anyone else that wanted to make a comment, Dr. Zeile?
Just a quick comment. I'm very sympathetic to looking for better ways to do things, but change always comes with a cost. And we should, I've kind of made it my hobby on the board to try to identify what are the trade-offs when we go in one direction versus another direction. And the McClellan plan, I concurred with the board's, I think I concurred with the board's response to that, because although you've got some great ideas, the devil is in the details. And I haven't seen those details worked out yet. So we have to address the concerns that Mr. Cousins has raised before we can implement a good idea.
Okay, and you had a comment as well? No? Okay. Next question, we will begin with Mr. Murray. It seems that the governor and legislature's intent is to defund public education to a point where it fails. Then for-profit market-based solutions ride to the rescue. What do you think of this theory?
In my opening, I did reference that is a tactic that's used, and I have great concerns about our Michigan Department of Education that it's so understaffed and so underfunded that it's not able to provide the leadership that we need. The whole idea of the funding going a different direction, we were one of the first school districts. I know Traverse City was the very first school district to have a seat time waiver. To have seat time waivers, and when we started into online learning, what we thought it was all about years ago and what we're seeing now are totally different. I think the common misconception is, okay, a kid gets a computer, sits down in front of the computer and does work. The support structure that we have to have for our students, many of whom are very highly at risk, that at-risk factor doesn't go away just because they're online. They don't have parents, and so we assign mentors to them that sit down with them every week and say, okay, show me your work that you did this last week. Let's go down, let's make a plan, let's set up a schedule for you. When are you going to get this done this next week? Do you know you've got this coming up? Let's take a look here. It looks like you didn't do well on this test. What are you doing to correct that? That kind of intervention, it ends up being, at best, a break-even proposition, and in many cases it costs us more, but we know that. We know that at-risk students cost us more than average students. And so looking at online learning is a way to cheapen education or to remove the role of the teacher. The reality of the situation when you get into it is that's not the case. And that's part of the message that I keep trying to bring across to the legislators, because I know Bill Rogers just made a proposal that online learning should be funded at 80% the FTE of a regular student. And again, it's how much understanding do they have of what's involved? We should have the resources to do whatever it takes, and the very students who need the most support are usually in the districts that are least capable of giving that, because they have the least amount of funding. Detroit is not the only example where that happens. And so then this whole cycle starts up of, well, look at how poorly performing the schools are. We have to come up with other solutions. The solutions should be based upon what can we do to make this situation work. I really think that there is a strong feeling that the way you make things better is to take away the good kids and leave the rest. You know, if I were coaching a baseball team and we had a losing season and all the other teams were allowed to come in and take my best players away, and then I got blamed for having another losing season, I would say this is totally unfair, but that's the situation that we're in Michigan.
Okay, your 2 minutes are up, but I'm not sure you answered the question. The for-profit market-based solutions, Do you think that this is a plan? This is what the audience member here is, yes or no? I
I
guess.
see the for-profit schools putting the same level of support into student success that we're putting in.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Did anyone else want to,
Yeah,
Mr. Cousins?
I don't think that there's a consensus. I think one of the problems we have in our state is that we don't have a coherent approach coming out of our legislature on, I mean, we're told in one sense that we're supposed to consolidate our schools, and in the other sense we want more charter schools. Well, they're just more schools. And again, let's make up our minds and let's move in a direction that actually improves things for kids. I think, I will say this, I know Mike does and Paul Soma and I do. I spend a lot of time talking to legislators, and I forgot, I actually did have a chance to talk to the governor. The chamber, local chamber provided an opportunity for us to have a couple meetings with the governor last year, so I kind of forgot about it. I do believe that one of the common things that gives me hope in this is that people, most of the people, 90% of the people involved in the equation want schools to be a better place for kids. I really believe that. I've never heard anything other than that out of folks. I do believe that there's a very strong and vocal group that believes that a free market approach to public education would be a solution to our problems. I definitely think that that's part of it. Is that meant to, is everybody espousing that from the state? Not at all. It's kind of convoluted. The problem I have with it is this, that, you know, I haven't had a lot of economics, but wherever you leverage a free market, you eventually create lower ends of that market. I mean, you can buy a really, really high-end computer, or for those that can't afford it, the market creates lower-end computers that don't do as much and don't do maybe everything they should. We'll create that in a free market system within education. We'll have the haves and the have-nots, because every free market creates that stratification of the product. And that's what's going to happen in public education if we follow that 100%. So.
Thank you, Mr. Cousins. Dr. Arson?
On that, I think what matters is the rules. Right? Choice is good. Right? It's not the only thing we care about. Right? Choice is the most freedom. That's a good thing. We pay attention to that. We want schools to be equitable. That's another standard. We want schools to be cost-effective, efficient. We also want schools to do some sort of social function that promotes social cohesion and democratic values. I mean, they're different. And if you're talking about a dashboard, and all you're looking at is one standard, increasing choice, which they're all good. It's always a trade-off and a question to balance. And you got a dashboard, and you're only trying to drive with looking at the odometer, right? And so I guess what I'm saying here is that yeah, you don't have to have the top end, low end. Let's promote choice, but do it in a way, and you structure the rules, right, so that you don't have the low end, so that you have the accountability, so you're balancing these different values, both public and private, and that's the job of the policymakers. And if you're only looking at one of those values and just going ahead on one of them, you're not going to end up where the citizens want you to be, or what's best for the children.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, everybody wants to comment. Great.
Well, first, a matter of fact, Detroit has been, for the last 40 years, among the top 10 per pupil funded systems. So it's not lack of money that accounts for Detroit's problems with dealing with educational effectiveness. On the matter of choice, educators and my colleagues on the board have a strong tendency to talk about quality as if it were one-dimensional. They're quality schools, they're low-end schools. But no, a quality engineering school is very different from a quality dance school. And when we talk about choice in the educational marketplace, we're talking about people being able to choose the curricula. I bought a home in Detroit because of the schools. And I sent my oldest daughter to Detroit School for Fine and Performing Arts, where she could major in violin. And that school didn't have the best math program. My other daughter went to Renaissance because they had the best math program in Detroit. So you see, quality is not one dimension, it's multidimensional. And the beauty of choice, it allows and it empowers parents to decide which factors are important to them and thus make the choice. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question, we'll begin again with Dr. Arson. Please address this concern. Explain why Michigan's top-to-bottom list is even used as an indicator of school success, charter or public, when Michigan is ranked 43rd in the nation, or has Michigan's state rank changed?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Are they talking about Michigan's
I think that,
ranking
I
on
think
the-
they're talking about all these plans ranking the schools.
Where are we on the NAEP? And how does that relate to our own rankings of schools?
Because we say failing, I think they're saying we have failing schools, successful schools, but it
Well, these are
seems
two
we're on the,
separate questions. I mean, they're two quite different measures. The NAEP is the nation's report card. It allows you to make comparisons across states, allows you to make comparisons over time. I don't think, and Michigan is a little bit below average. It depends on the subject matter or the grade level. We're not one of the high flyers. Okay? I just say, if one thing, and on some things we're in the 40s, right, on student performance. We are a state that is you know, the percentage of children who are poor is increasing. It's increased a lot, and that matters in these rankings across states. Okay, but I just mentioned this on that test, the nation's report card. What's the nation's #1 ranked state? I mentioned before. It's Massachusetts. Massachusetts does a lot of interesting things. They've invested, they've had consensus, decision-making, planning long-term among business communities, among the researchers, among the educators. They took the different pieces of the education, teacher preparation, finance, higher ed, coordination. It's really an impressive undertaking. This is a state that has many similarities to Michigan. It's a northern state. They have unions there. They have African-American people. They have multiracial. They have rural, urban. We have 1.5 million people. They have 1 million. A lot of similarities. We could look to them for some good examples. I'm struck when I hear an advisor for the governor saying, we're trying to be more like Louisiana. Louisiana, number 49, number 50. I don't understand.
And let me just
Mr. Austin,
yeah.
can we hold the applause, please, because we don't have much
Massachusetts does some
time
things
left?
that we were doing on the right path, a coherent path to reform. They were one of the first to go with high rigorous standards, including at the high school level, which we mimicked. They also have new choices and charters only created by local school districts if it's going to be a quality addition, and the State Board of Education. And you know, we have many charters, and I will dissent from my colleague Richard's dissent. We have too many charters that the authorizers aren't policing them, and we're going to see some new information come out. There's going to be a good investigative piece on many schools where the authorizers are not policing the management companies, and they're making way too much money while delivering poor quality education in this state, which is preventable a la Massachusetts. They also spend 40% more for education in Massachusetts. Period. They invest more in education while they have a coherent reform strategy, which we were on. High standards, accountability, better support for teachers, new models, new choices if they're quality, and turning around failing schools. That's the agenda that the nation's been on, Michigan was on, but now we have this new market-making, free market theology, and it's exactly what Stephen says. You try to blend the two, you get chaos. You can't say, let's do better with this coherent strategy and help our schools succeed and create new choices where we need them and consolidate schools to save money and then have a market created. It's chaos. And that's what I told the governor's folks last year when this first emerged. What are we doing here, people? We've been on a path of this. Now you want to introduce this? It's going to be a nightmare.
Dr. Ziley?
Just point out one fact that you may not be aware of. 45 or more states require children to have their birthday turning 5 by September 1st before entering into school. Michigan, up until this past year, the birth date was December 1st. That means that our students are being compared to a nationwide sample that is a quarter of a year older. If academic development correlates with chronology, then no wonder we are edging towards the bottom half. Now, the state board has taken steps to bring our age requirements in line with the other states, and I think this will address at least a part of what we see in some of these state-by-state comparisons. Thank you.
Thank you.
One
Yes.
comment about the rankings too is, a ranking doesn't necessarily tell you anything about the performance of the schools or the students. I go to the Olympic trials, track and field trials every year. Every guy in the final of the 100 meters is really fast. Now, there's a person who gets first and a person who gets 10th, and if you just say, well, he got 10th in the Olympic trials, sounds pretty bad. But he's really, really fast. And so I think that we have to be more intelligent about looking at data when we talk about how we're performing. And I think that, go back to the bottom to top ranking things, I think we need to have measures that moms and dads and educators can look at and the public can look at to say, this is how we're performing, that really give at least a more accurate picture and that are intelligent. Rankings don't tell us a whole lot. How kids perform, their growth rates and things like that, I think that's important for us to look at. So I think that's a step in the right direction. I don't think it was done as well as it could have been done, but I think it's a step in the right direction for us to be a little bit more transparent about how we're performing.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Austin, this question is actually for you. Is the piece in the Detroit News on the secret skunk works task force charged with creating 5,000 per pupil value schools? You were quoted as declaring that you knew nothing about this secretive project. Most people were surprised that the State Board of Education wouldn't be aware of such a project. Please comment on the role of the State Board in setting policy. Where does the buck stop in education policy in Michigan?
We, as a state board, are trying to do our job, which is to provide leadership and supervision and to make recommendations to the governor and legislature, which we do. Governors are elected, they have influence, they make their own recommendations. I have a nice signed copy of the governor's education message of last year, because we did make recommendations before he made that message, and many of those recommendations showed up in there. There are many things that he proposed that we didn't agree with, and this idea that he commissioned or his staff commissioned to develop covertly a set of ways to design an online school model with private companies when the public versions of that were exposed in legislation last year is certainly something we didn't know about as a state board. They didn't tell us they were working quietly and secretly to try to design proposals that the governor might advance or might not, because I think they knew, because we already called out successfully last fall with your help, that the proposals that they were designing for the governor were potentially debilitating and damaging, and so they were doing them secretly. We didn't know about it, and then I immediately contact our superintendent. I don't think, given the way this is being done, and that it's unauthorized, non-governmental, and that it is secret, and it's excluding educators, this is not appropriate for the superintendent to have assigned someone from a state department to participate in. So we do not play in this. And we were unaware the superintendent had assigned someone, so I was not happy with the superintendent, told him, get that person. We're not participating in this. The state board, who you work for, does not support this. Now, I recommend the piece I brought and our recommendations to the governor on how to do, back to Mr. Murray's point, many of the things that are in the proposals can be done if they're done in a way that's helpful, not hurtful to education. We can create new choices. We can unbundle funding to better support outcomes and options for kids if it's done in a way that incents and rewards learning and better outcomes, not incents and rewards new bad learning that takes resources and dismantles public education. So we're for making change, but only if it's done to improve education and outcomes. And there's only one measure of that. Do the kids learn? Do they graduate? Do they go on to great next steps? It's not hard to tell.
Okay, thank you. Did anyone else want to, please limit to a minute, because I want to give you time for, all right, gotcha.
I think it would be a shame if the effort didn't continue. I think it was a shame that it was done covertly. I think it's great that it's out in the open now. I think it's wonderful that Superintendent Flanagan's going to head it up. I think he has good judgment. I think that he will lead that group well. But we have to have conversations about change, and we have to have conversations about innovation. And if the conversation about changing schools got scuttled because of this, that would be the worst outcome. Let's recognize that we shot ourselves in the foot collectively as a group going forward, and let's move forward and be more positive about what could come out of it.
And I've got to add, that's what I told the governor and their folks. You got to get rid of McClellan because you're shooting yourselves in the foot of constructively engaging with the state board, with the public, with educators, with legislators on how we continue this change. Now, again, I had to tell Mike Flanagan, our superintendent today, we need to talk a bit more about the nature of what we're going to do as a board and a superintendent who works for the board in terms of looking at what further discussions we have about any skunk work planning that we are going to refocus. And we are not yet sure what we're going to look like, whether the superintendent is going to do it, and whether in what way we're going to continue this effort. I think we're going to flip it around. I mean, what I'd like to do, let's flip it around. Not how do we create a plan for new online option that reduces the number of teachers. Let's figure out a plan for how we use technology to help teachers help kids learn better. That's what we should be about, and that's what I want to make sure, if we continue and if our superintendent is involved, that's what this work is about. In public view, I mean, all of that's good, and that's what it needs to be.
Okay, we're running out of time, and I want to give you at least 4 or 5 minutes for closing statements. There was one question that I thought was important, so if you could maybe address that in your closing statement. What advice do you have for parents, teachers, and students who want to stop the Oxford plan in its tracks? Many who live and work in the communities that have strong, vibrant schools like TCAPs aren't paying attention. And you might just want to address about how to involve parents. And we'll start our closing statements with you, Mr. Cousins.
You know, I do believe legislators actually track the contacts that people make with them, and I think that we underestimate the voice that folks who live in Traverse City Area Public Schools District have. I can talk to legislators till I'm blue in the face, but they see me coming and they already think I have a certain agenda that, more money, more money, more money. I think that when parents and community members talk to them and contact them, you have a very powerful voice, and they do listen. It doesn't always change what they do totally, but they do listen to that. I think that what we need to be telling them is to start with reforms that work, and I'm going to share 3 things that I shared with Lieutenant Governor Calley either last year or the year before. And we look at the asset we have in this state. We have, I think the governor's right when he talks about developing talent. I think he's been spot on about that since he became governor. We graduate and export talented teachers to other states and talented principals every year because we graduate more than we need. So let's leverage that. Teachers are expected to get results from kids today based on new standards, but we haven't changed the training for teachers dramatically in probably the last 10 years. So let's increase the requirements for the profession. Let's have teachers get involved in doing clinical experience like they do in a hospital, live coaching. Let's require a master's degree in instruction. Let's have them work narrow down the field and have them work in teaching schools where we pay them a stipend. We'll have extra helping hands, and we'll increase the level of the profession. We'll give them the tools they need right out of the box to be successful as teachers. This wouldn't be a huge investment for the state in regard to what it would cost, and it's one way to leverage the talent that we already have. Number 2, we have to leverage technology. We can't do what the Finnish did because there doesn't seem to be the political will to put 2 teachers in every classroom. But we can create virtually 2 and 3 and 4 or 5 teachers in the classroom and help teachers leverage technology so that they can get the kind of results that we're asking them collectively as a community to get, so that they don't have to teach with a hand tied behind their back. We're doing that in TCAPS. We're leveraging with our One to World flipped classrooms and blended instruction and online learning. But we need to invest in our teachers and invest in technology so that they can leverage the resources that are available online to get them the results that they need to have. And then third, and again, this is a big initiative for us in TCAPS, universal preschool. Let's get them ready for school. Let's just quit talking about it and let's do it. Nothing will get us such a greater impact on our kids than if we just dive in and solve the problem of universal preschool. Give every kid and parent who wants their kid to be ready for school the chance to have that. And then let's keep those interventions in place through 5th grade, because if we don't, we know that a lot of the improvements will cash out down the road. So let's invest in them early on so that the cost of education down the road when they're repeating classes or they have to have special programs because we didn't get it right the first time, we decrease the cost there and we can put it on the front end. And let's quit gathering students, like Mike said, based solely on their age and their neighborhood. Let's not get rid of that for the kids it works with. Let's be honest, it works with some, with many. But let's be more creative and let's use research to gather kids together in ways so that teachers can truly differentiate with the kids that are in front of them. And again, they're not asked to do something that's almost impossible, which is differentiate for every kid that comes in their room, no matter what.
Thank you, Mr. Cousins. Under time, right, Ronnie? And universal preschool, the league is behind you on that. I probably shouldn't editorialize, but I will. Mr. Murray, your closing statement, please, in 4 to 5 minutes.
I'll editorialize on the universal preschool because that's one of my passions as well. And not only does it make sense from an educational standpoint, but the studies have shown that it can save up to $17 for every dollar spent if you invest up front. That's also a good way to work on equity of opportunity because you have the chance. And it's not just preschool, but it's the whole program, including the parenting communities that are so important, because you have to take a look at the fabric of our society. It's not the same as it was a couple generations ago, and we need to work on that. Second point, pilots. We have gone to legislators and gone to Michigan Department of Education for years now and said, we would like the right to innovate. Give us a chance to do pilots to prove some of these things. And part of my conversation with some of the people who did the Oxford Foundation was educators don't like to jump into something new and unproven. They like to go someplace, look at this program in action, see the results, talk to the people who work in the program, and then if they see that it works somewhere else, they will consider it. This is the way you bring about innovation. You don't just throw out ideas, but you start working them in places where you can study them and show results. Now for parents, I would say don't deal with the whole of the Oxford Foundation plan as a whole. Take a look at those pieces that you like and those pieces that you don't like. When you talk to legislators, I would talk to their aides, because really, the aides are the ones who really digest all the information and give it to the legislators. They're the ones who give the summaries of feedback from people. They're the ones who are going to have the greatest influence over the legislators. And stick to just a couple of points. There are so many things in the Oxford Foundation. Pick 2 or 3 pieces that you like or don't like the most and work through the legislative aides to get that viewpoint in, and that's where you can have the greatest impact.
Thank you, Mr. Murray. And we'll come back to Dr. Arson for your concluding statement.
Sure. Thanks, it's been a pleasure. I want to make 3 points. First, I want to take a step back with all these discussions of newfangled approaches to education and say let's not lose sight of the purpose of public education. Public schools have both private and public good characteristics. I'd say it is important for public schools to prepare students for effective participation in the adult labor market. But they also have to equip students with the knowledge and perspectives and dispositions they need to engage in reasoned and civil debate of public issues, the sort of thing that we're doing here. And in fact, it's that fact aspect of public education that deserves, that justifies is being provided publicly. To have a strong democracy, we have to cultivate the habits of listening to the views of people unlike ourselves And the school's the most important setting for that to happen. Okay? And in addition, schools they're not just creating cognitive skills that can be measured on a test, but non-cognitive skills as well. So leadership, resilience, empathy. And so when I see things like the Oxford proposal, I worry that we're getting a too narrow sense of what public schools are about. They have to have both the social aspect and the public and the private, the cognitive and the non-cognitive. Point number one. Second point, we can't be struck. We can't help but being struck by all the newfangled ways that are taking place to provide education services. Contracting relationships, consolidation, online, new providers, changes in employment relations, just extraordinary changes in public education. And it's sometimes difficult for policymakers and school officials to know what's best practice. And what best practice is might depend on local circumstances. Okay? Cost effectiveness is not the only standard that matters. I mentioned that a moment ago. But it's a good standard. And lots of people talk about cost effectiveness, but don't know what it is. And it got put in different pieces of different legislation. The Oxford Foundation talked about it. But this is a language. It's not just about lowering costs, but getting the outcomes that you want. And here's a place. We don't want just more innovation. We want things that are cost effective, that work. Okay? And we can't know that unless we do the research. Do pilots, go small, figure out what works. Okay? And in building on things that early childhood education is the best example we have where the research clearly points to that it's cost effective. Most of these other things that we're talking about, various forms of online, there's a lot of details. We really need to know more before we go real big. Okay? It's not a message of don't innovate. It's a message that do it smart and do it in a way that's cost effective. And finally, my third point, it relates to process. And this corresponds to things you said before. You've heard it in different ways. I just want to recast. We have a lot of work to do in education policy, but the process by which we get there is important. My own view is that the process that's been taken up by the Oxford group, that sort of took it outside of government, and even less transparent with this more recent skunk group, that's not a promising strategy. Let me tell you an old story. Just reminds you, back in the day, when Proposal A was passed, the House of Representatives was split between the Republicans and Democrats, and the caucus leaders asked for a group of 6 Republicans and 6 Democrats to get together and meet and hammer out a plan for funding the new system. And these are people that knew each other for over many, many years, worked together many years. They knew they'd have to work with them in the future. There was 150 years of accumulated experience in those 12 people in education issues. Now we have mandatory inexperience law. We don't have people with term limits. Okay, so we got it. This is a reality. We need to work around this. And I would just say, in terms of process, I'm glad to hear what John's saying here about the steps you're taking in the direction you want to go. I just add that you can't have a performance regime. No governor can have a performance regime without embracing and listing the perspectives, the experience of the educators. Okay? They have to be part of the story. They can't be said you're illegitimate. Include them, include the researchers. Go to the business community. Okay? And forums like this.
Thank you, Dr. Arson. Mr. Austin, you have 5 minutes. If you'd like to share them with Dr. Zeile, that's up to you.
Share my minutes.
Only because we're almost out of
Quickly,
time, so.
thank you for participating. 2 things. One, we've got to keep our eye on the target. How do we organize? How do we support? How do we reorganize? And how do we financially fund education in whatever way we deliver it, so that the kids learn what we need them to learn to have the skills to navigate in a changing world, and they graduate and they're successful at next steps in an unlimited way. And to do that, we've got to be open to any and all ideas, including anything that's coming out of the Oxfords or even the skunk group. But we've got to talk about it and work with it in terms of, if we shape it this way, is it going to get more of those outcomes that we care about, or is it going to do damage to some kids or the outcomes we care about? And we have to be willing to say, let's support these changes that will get us better outcomes for more kids, and let's be willing to oppose things that don't deliver outcomes that we care about or do damage to some while helping others succeed. So we need to keep having that open, iterative conversation and push policies that do that into practice. Second, I was as chagrined as many at the Governor's Summit because, education is not about, and I appreciate Richard's comments very much, preparing for jobs of today. It is not, and the diminishment of education for education's sake that was also in the air. Education needs to be about building the foundational skills to participate and the navigational skills to be able to keep recreating, respecializing, and finding your path in life. I want to point to an example, and it may mean living in your basement. If you're doing great work and having a satisfying life, and Steve Jobs and Larry Page, they created a new business in their garage. It's close to the basement. And Jobs dropped out of Harvard. I mean, he's a college dropout. But Jobs is fascinating because he has the kind of education that we need to nurture in whatever form is right for all our kids. Wonderful computer skills, sharp technical skills that he developed, married to what he called a liberal arts aesthetic. He was so glad he took the calligraphy and other courses because it taught him about fonts and what people appreciate aesthetically. Put those two together, you have someone who changed the world and created massive wealth and millions of jobs because they put together the liberal arts, critical thinking, aesthetic sensibility with hard, solid skills on computer science. Now, that's a different version of that's going to be right for another kid. You don't know who's going to be the person that creates the next new thing. Could be an artist, could be a history major. Look at what the 1% majored in. There's a great little report. What did the 1% major in? They majored in everything. If you're really good and passionate and skilled, you can find a way to make money if you're in that top 10 who make the qualifying rounds. This is it. So our job as educators is to create an environment in which everybody finds that path and finds the way to apply themselves and have those lights go off. Richard?
Well, because you're giving me a your time, I should say something nice about you.
Yes.
And it has been a real joy serving on our State Board of Education because of two people. One is Superintendent Flanagan, who is currently the longest-serving state superintendent in our nation. I operated a parochial school when he was the RESA superintendent and have been an admirer of his from those days and continually be impressed with his selflessness, his adaptability, his commitment to children and their welfare. So we're extremely fortunate to have him during these difficult times for public education at the helm. Another person who has made it a real joy has been John Austin. He has a gift for finding common ground among people of vastly different perspectives and views. I deeply respect that. I sure would hate it if you ran for another office there. So I want to throw out that tribute. And finally, I want to say, you have the power, if you care enough to be informed. Now, here's an example. There's a big bandwagon developing on universal preschool. How many of you have heard about the U.S. Department of Education study of 15,000 preschool children in California last year, which found that this really helped 20% of the kids and held back about 40%. You see, preschool makes sense for families that need it, but universal preschool will actually retard the development of children if there are any lasting effects. And studies of Head Start have shown that the so-called benefits of Head Start disappear by second grade. The President's own commission 2 years ago reported this to him. Nevertheless, he asked for more money, and Congress gave it to him for Head Start. I would not want to see another big failure like Head Start to be developed because people jumped on a bandwagon for universal preschool. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This concludes our forum. There are a lot of questions that didn't get asked, but we'll make sure that the participants get to see your concerns. Thank you to the panelists for your participation. Thanks to the team that worked on the forum. Thanks to you, members of the audience, for your attendance and for your attention.